Welcome to Wisdom for Life, where we sift through philosophy to find practical advice that you can use in your everyday life. Hi, I'm Dan Hayes. I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Greg Sadler, and today we're talking about
a selection of philosophy questions answered.
Yeah, so Greg's had done a whole bunch of AMAs forever. People would give him lots of questions, and we've compiled a number of them here for us to go over on condensed, maybe a little rapid fire. And hopefully we'll give some meaty answers. If we want to go deeper, we will. So 93 sessions, or sorry, 6 AMAs with 93 done. Hopefully this is a little useful advice. We are answering questions here. And, obviously we want to give you some good thoughts, but none of these are going to be very rigorous in that we've written down a lengthy dissertation on them. These are a little bit off the cuff, but we have thought about them to a certain extent.
Yeah, they're all within our wheelhouse, I think you can say. And they should be hopefully thought-provoking for people who are listening to this or, thinking about these sorts of things. And before we get started, I will say that I do have some pat answers that I've developed over the years, not deliberately, but I find myself giving these as answers to a lot of the Ask Me Anything questions. And some of these might be useful for people to think about, for their own worries or questions. So I came up with 5, and I'd kind of like to get your take on these, Dan. So here, I'll just run through them. So sometimes I say to the person, wow, you're making some big assumptions here, in the question that you're asking. Maybe some of these assumptions aren't really warranted, or they'll ask about a philosopher or a school and they'll say, Nietzsche says blah, blah, blah. And I'll say, well, no, he doesn't say that. And these are completely open to the public. So it could be anybody basically walking in off the virtual street, and sometimes they've gotten misconceptions about different philosophers. I say an awful lot.
You're saying that the grapevine of philosopher to YouTube to consumer isn't a totally infallible pipeline?
Well, I mean, I don't know how the pipeline could. You mean a pipeline of infallible people?
There is none.
No, I mean, find me one infallible person. Another thing that comes up a lot, I wind up saying this a good bit, is people will ask me about things. Here's a great example. They'll say what is the advantage of virtue ethics over deontology and utilitarianism? And I'll be like, that is at such a high level of abstraction that it wouldn't even do you any good to answer that question. There is no deontology. There's a whole school of approaches that we call deontological. Kant is one of them, but he's very different than intuitionist ethics or divine command theory. And when we get to virtue ethics, it's even more all over the map. But I think people, they really do think in terms of these big picture abstractions. And then, people get really upset. They'll say Sam Harris has shown that there is no such thing as free will. And I'll be like, how could he possibly have done that? What basis could a person possibly have for these totally sweeping metaphysical claims? Has he researched every single instance where a person was said to make a free decision? No, nobody has. So, any of these sorts of claims like that. And then the other thing that I sometimes tell people is that's a worry that you get to have later on. You don't need to worry at at a beginner level or intermediate level. You don't need to worry about that stuff quite yet. A lot of people put the cart before the horse. So none of the questions that we have lined up here are going to get those sort of answers. But it's kind of funny that I wind up sliding into the same grooves now after doing almost 100 of these,
So I guess the one thing I would grab here is the idea that philosophy is sometimes described as a conversation over centuries.
Oh, yeah.
And to use that analogy going forward is some of these questions are I've just sat down. I've heard someone say, I don't know, deontology, and then you start spewing whatever comes out of your mouth immediately when you know about that. But you haven't actually sat down long enough to actually even know the basic basis of that even section of the conversation. And so doing a little reading and kind of trying to just dig in and listen to what is going on in the conversation is necessary before you even start, like, providing some of these questions in a really nuanced way, or at least very much more than pushing back on someone.
Yeah, I think in some respect, the sort of like, let's summarize websites and, like intro classes and textbooks probably are responsible for a good bit of that, right? Like you take an intro to philosophy class with an intro textbook and it will tell you, like ethics, is divided into 4 main schools on it, egoism, utilitarianism, deontology, and virtue ethics, which is completely not true, but they'll say that. And, if you're a student, why wouldn't you believe the textbook, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, they're the experts. And in your other classes, probably the experts are actually on point. You take a botany class, you presume that the professor and the textbook are both, well researched and right. So I'm not saying that, like these people should have done their due diligence or something like that. How could they, right? Mm-hmm. But yeah, they kind of hamstring themselves, unfortunately,
Yeah. And like, I understand people want to, know and also be part of that conversation. And like, I would never like dissuade someone from asking questions. But I guess there a good answer to some of those things are listen first and then we'll talk later.
Yeah. That's an interesting idea for what I can do down the line with some of these. So let's jump in. So we're going to try to do short answers to each of these. We might go longer than we want to, but we're not going to do like absolute lightning round 30-second or something like that. But we're going to try to keep these fairly short. So here's a really interesting one. Would you say there's a big advantage of studying philosophy at the university, or is it the type of subject you can study on your own without much trouble? What do you think?
I think it depends on who you are. Sometimes it is very useful to have a structured environment to deal into this. If you are so incredibly pulled into the topic of philosophy that you can just do that by yourself, maybe you find some reading guides or whatnot, you could probably learn a lot about it, but you wouldn't get the full interaction or like understanding unless you're actually having discussions with other people that are already also dealing with the text. So you also have that some component. University provides both a structure as well as a place for you to have those deep discussions.
Yeah, I think that's a really good feature and point is you don't go to the university just to like sit in a classroom with a brilliant professor who's going to like, give you lectures and then ask you a few questions. It's also your engagement with your fellow students and maybe people who are a little bit further along. I wonder though, I mean, do you think that you can get that, especially today because we've got, the internet and all these great groups out there. Do you think you could get that more now, say, than 40 years ago when, you really didn't have anything like that available unless you lived in like a big city and there was like a philosophy meetup that you would go to?
Yeah, I don't like definitely from 40 years to now, I would say that's a lot easier to do that. The question is that the same quality? Is it a one-to-one drop-in? Can you find a one-to-one drop-in to actually having like a whole large group of people that are dedicated to, hey, say we're going to be reading Kant this week or this section of, I don't know, the genealogy and morals by Nietzsche or something, and actually have a deep dive into this with other people who are very, very interested and are well read, and you can have some really good back and forth. That's much harder because if you're just doing it kind of ad hoc, then you have to find some other cohort of people that are also willing to be talking about the same things that you are reading.
Yeah, I will say it really does depend though on which like academic institution that you are going to. And I'm not going to say that like the higher prestige ones are necessarily better in that respect. They might actually be more narrow, like, so you can study analytic philosophy at this place. But if you're really into Derrida, they're all like, yeah, he's a charlatan, we're not going to talk about him. Or if you're into Stoicism, maybe they're like, yeah, that's too popular, we're not doing that kind of stuff. So I think it depends. You can't generalize about like academia per se. You really would have to look at like, well, who's teaching, what kind of stuff are they interested in, does it match your interest to some degree? And I think you want to look for a place that has like a wide variety of approaches that they're studying, right? So it's not just, all we do all day is Kant.
Yeah, I had a ethics professor that didn't even touch virtue. It's like,
oh, really?
Yeah.
It wasn't just because they ran out of time in the semester, was it? Or
no, it was not even on the syllabus from the very beginning.
Interesting.
Yeah. It was deontology and utilitarian and I can't remember exactly.
Maybe egoism or.
I don't even remember egoism.
Yeah. I mean, there is like a pressure, when you're teaching stuff, you're always doing triage, right? You've only got 15 weeks in a semester. I mean, that might be another advantage of doing stuff on your own. You can study as much as you want rather than just whatever it is that the professor can cram into 15 weeks,
Yeah. And I guess that's the nice thing of people like you and others that are doing lectures online. If you want to find a good lecturer, you can find that nowadays as a supplement to something that you might be able to access.
In the old days, you were just basically screwed. If you were lucky, you might find, VHS cassettes or DVDs of the great courses, if depending on, whether your library even had that kind of stuff.
Right. And the next best thing is like what, a commentary?
Oh, yeah. But you would have to know. I mean, with some of these things, it's that not knowing what you don't know, right?
Right.
So if you know that there are commentaries out there, then you can go look for them in the library. And if your library doesn't have them, you could like ask the librarian, hey, where can I get a commentary on Thomas Aquinas or Kant or whoever? But if that's just like not on your radar at all, how would you know?
No.
Well, let's
what are some advice that you have for better relating philosophical ideas from texts to real life and applying them? So praxis, basically.
Yeah. I've always been doing that, but I'm kind of an outlier in academic philosophy. I noticed a lot of my peers didn't do that and weren't very cool with me doing that. Unless there was like something that was already very practical. It's interesting because I had a client the other day who was saying, I really like Stoicism because the Stoic texts seem much more practical than Plato or Aristotle. And I was like, well, they are, because they tell you like, here's a practice, here's what to do in this situation. But you can do that with Aristotle. You just have to do some legwork, right? Yeah. So think about Aristotle and the idea of the virtuous mean. He's got like, 11 virtues that he examines with vices on each side. And now it's up to you. He gives you the stuff and he's like, okay, go out and do this. And you might say, well, how the hell do I do that? Well, he's already given you some guidelines, Is my reaction excessive, defective? Am I getting angry for the right reasons, the wrong reasons? But you have to kind of figure out that's what's required,
No. It's kind of analogy here is engineers and mechanics were engineers to machinists.
Okay.
And so if a lot of mechanics will like curse at engineers, especially if you're like a car mechanic, because
Yeah.
they've designed it in such a stupid way that taking it apart to fix the thing or to replace the thing requires 13 more steps than it really should. Or
Yeah.
it's like down some hole and it's behind 3 other pieces that shouldn't be there.
You got to get the ratchet, which has got like that. What's the thing that like it's the angle thing for the ratchet?
Yeah. Like
Turning it.
I needed to be 30 degrees off of the the vertical positions.
Yeah.
And the other one is machinist. If I, not that I'm a mechanical engineer, but if I was a mechanical engineer, I can design something up in CAD that has it's a physical object, but it may never be able to be machined in any way that is possible with like your regular lathe or the other tool that is lost in my mind at the moment. So like, hey, you want to have a tolerance or like a piece of a flange that's like 13/100ths of an inch. You can technically do it, but it's going to fall apart because there's nothing there to hold it together, or the forces of milling it. That's the other word, the mill. It's going to tear the part apart when you try to do the rest of the pieces. And so if you don't have that conversation back and forth, then you have bad designs. And so I think that if you're not actually trying to live the philosophy, then there's no experimental proof that these ideas are actually good.
That's a really good point. And I like that you're also talking about like having a conversation about it, because you and I have talked about this a number of times. A lot of times in philosophy, people act as if like you're a solo, you're doing it all on your own, but we have so many blind spots that it's really helpful to have other people to bounce ideas off of. And, somebody who actually I think is kind of cool in that respect is Seneca, when he's talking about the Stoics have the sage who's like this legendary figure, gets everything completely right. And Seneca actually, I don't remember which letter it's in. He's thinking about, does the sage need friends? And he's like, well, he doesn't need them in the way that other people do, but he'll want them, and he'll want them precisely because even the like totally enlightened person is going to have blind spots. And the best thing would be to have another sage to help you out and say, hey man, watch out for that.
Right.
Well, let's do the next one. Even if large language models aren't intelligent, do you think there's something philosophically interesting about them because they're able to mimic language so well?
So I find them to be interesting in part because like the perceptrons, like the smallest atomic unit of machine learning models, are based off of neurons.
Yeah.
And so they're a simulacrum of neurons. But the way that we build them is not at all how regular organic creatures have synapses and neurons connected to each other. So it's this like basic building blocks built in a very like kind of mechanical way, and we're getting some very interesting outputs from them. But I don't think they're like intelligent. At least we're talking about LLMs. But because we also haven't solved the like hard problem of consciousness, I don't know exactly when things will become actually intelligent, if there is a way that we can physically make these things to be intelligent, to be not like not artificial intelligent anymore, like they're actually intelligent. And that I think is an interesting thing. I just don't think that the LLMs are that.
Yeah, I was actually reading something recently about Turing tests and saying what we really need are much more distinctions about. So a Turing test, can a artificial intelligence pass as human? And they're saying it makes a big difference whether it has to pass for 5 minutes or 5 hours, or with Joe Blow off the street, or somebody who actually knows the topic that's being discussed and all that. And I think there's something to that. Some of the the various AIs that we have, and some of which are LLMs, but there's other types as well. They're pretty good, at what they do, and especially if they're like in a technical field, it makes perfect sense to use them for radiology because they're catching tumors that the radiologists aren't catching, and you can be like a partner with it. And I don't think we necessarily have to say that's intelligent, but it sure is interesting. As a matter of fact, a little bit veering off. So I'm going to be teaching a professional writing class this coming semester. And one of the things that we discuss quite a bit in the professional writing class is what do we do with LLMs? How do we make sense of this? Should you just like say, don't ever use that? That's not my stance. I'm like, hey, you should learn how to use this responsibly. And by the way, you're on the hook for making sure that every single thing that this claims, it's not a hallucination. You got to do the fact checking for it, because it's not going to fact check itself at this point in time.
Right. I just had a great idea.
Oh, go ahead.
So I think one of the useful ways of doing this for professional writing is to like say, hey, here's my, like, you make your first draft and you say, hey, clean this up, give me some ideas or whatnot. Oftentimes it says, like, let's rewrite it. Are you familiar with what a diff is in computer science?
No.
So
it might be, but I don't know it by.
It goes line by line. It tells you what lines were added and what lines were removed.
Oh, okay.
And each individual character that was also removed from that line. If like a line was just changed, like you change a color from red to blue or something. I think it would be very useful to give me that, and I want to see a diff and put them side by side and give your first draft and its thing, and it highlights all the things that it changed, so that you have an easy way to look at, okay, here are the things that changed, and I can then zoom in and make sure that it's not making any factual errors on any of the things that it changed.
Yeah, or losing some of the information that I think needs to be in there. Yeah, that's a great idea. I think. I don't want to stay on this too long, particularly the writing thing, but the students are kind of at sea. There's some of them that are like, well, if I do this, is it cheating? And yeah, I mean, if you're just substituting, if you're supposed to do discussion forums and you just put it into, an LLM, and you don't do any writing of your own, okay, that's probably not good. But they're not going away. So these students really do need to learn how to incorporate the prompt designing and tweaking tone and all that sort of stuff into their writing.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you find particularly interesting about LLMs, though?
I guess when I talk about like intelligence, because like I'm a fan of sci-fi, and there's this question of like, at what point in time do you find a thing to be intelligent to then have moral value, that it needs to then be have
rights that would be respected,
protections, and then that is a philosophical question, because if you're a fan of Star Trek, there's this thing of the drumhead is a story about how Data is being perceived as just a robot by parts of Starfleet, and Picard has to defend
the case, right? Yeah.
He makes a case that like, no, he is an individual and therefore should have rights. And that's a purely philosophical question. And so that is a place that I would go in.
Yeah, I mean, we've got Asimov stories too, where he's like explicitly raising these questions, sometimes in courtrooms, which is kind of interesting. Yeah, so I think that's a good set of answers for that.
Yeah.
Now, switching back to community-based things, and I think you might be a better person for answering this because you have more experience with groups.
Yeah.
I'm trying to start a philosophy club at my community college. Do you have any tips or advice for running a philosophy club?
First thing is ask your university if they have any funds or anything that like allows that to happen. Like at my university, that there were funds and rooms and club fairs. So like, all the clubs on campus would, put up a booth and say like, hey, I want to do something like this. come and hang out with us. Give us your email and whatnot. And so, like, look at the resources that are available to you. And advice for running philosophy clubs. People get really excited when they're talking about things, and they will often talk over everyone else, or they will wait for any moment in a conversation in order to insert themselves into the conversation. And it is not good for being able to actually actively listen and to try to pull in ideas because you're just worried about yelling the next thing. And so I think one of the things that I found in running philosophical groups is to make sure, like, it's basically like, having a speaking stick, making sure that everyone has the ability to speak, that everyone has their moment to speak, and that you're not having people just run roughshod over that. And because you'll have people that are of different willingness to jump into that fray. And if you don't provide a space in which the people that are not so aggressive or assertive, then you'll never hear those really good ideas those people have.
Right. Yeah. Do you think there needs to be some structure? And I could imagine it being in two senses. One would be like, so, you mentioned having like a speaking stick, right? I'm not saying like you need to do like, Roger's Rules of Order or something like that. That would be way overkill. Mm-hmm. But maybe there needs to be some, like, let's call them procedural norms, Mm-hmm. But then do you think that you need to have structure in a different way? Like you say, okay, so this session we're going to be devoting to reading this book. Mm-hmm. Not just like, hey, everybody come and we'll just talk philosophy.
Having a topic at the very least. Okay. If you have something to actually read, that's also a boon. And then also, if you're having some sort of, to go to the question of, do you need something like not quite Roger's Rules, but something, yes, you need to have some norms, and they need to have buy-in, and you can't just impose that. You have to actually have a conversation with those people, because if you have buy-in, then the people that are in your group will help you adjudicate and support those rules when there's a new person that comes in, they want to try to violate those norms.
That leads to another kind of interesting part or subtopic. So if you're going to have a club and it's going to be surviving over time, you kind of have to do some succession planning. Now, if it's like a community club, you could have one person who's, I don't know, leading it for 10 years or something. But if you're at a community college, people are in and out every 2 years. So if you want your club to be something that's going to survive, as soon as you start it, you basically have to be looking for 2 or 3 people who you can count on to continue it. Right. And that's where buy-in becomes really important. Because if you have one person who's like a big leader in charge of everything, that's never going to happen. Right.
Absolutely. And community colleges are, I guess at that point, you would probably want to hopefully find like some professor there that is going to be longer, that can be some sort of continuity.
Yeah, that's a good point. You need somebody. Oftentimes, the clubs will have advisors or something like that. You want somebody who's going to be a bit more hands-on than just like signing off and saying, have a good time.
Like they should probably be the person that was trying to help with succession. Like not that
that's a good idea. Yeah,
leader, but like he's the one that's like, okay, if it's going to end, we need to have. Okay, there's a new guy. He's really into it. Like, and then try to make sure that he's getting the handoff well, and maybe he holds onto the documents.
A professor, if they're good in the classroom, could probably also help with the over-enthusiastic person. Like, you're like, I don't know what to do with this person in the group. They keep dominating the conversations. Well, you could go to that professor and say, hey, what do you do when you got a student in your class who's really into what it is that you're doing? So you don't want to shut them down. But you do want to, like, I don't know, pare it back a bit, how to do that diplomatically. They could be a great resource for that, I think.
Yeah. I think we should move on to the next one.
Sure.
So if you have complete control over the philosophical curriculum in the places that you teach, what changes, if any, would you implement?
Okay. So, I am interested to hear what I know that you don't teach at an academic institution, but you could imagine yourself doing that, and it'd be interesting to hear what you have to say. So, I teach at a Institute of Art and Design where I'm the only person basically teaching philosophy. There's a few other people teaching things that kind of veer into philosophy. So that's not a good one for that place because I already do control what I'm going to teach. I will admit, though, one failing on my part, which is, so I'm teaching at an Institute of Art and Design. One of the classes that I have not yet designed for the place, aesthetics. That's a big gap, right? So right. So maybe what I need to do is say, hey, Greg, get your ass in gear and design an aesthetics class because, you've got ethics for artists and designers and, all sorts of other classes. That's the one that absolutely should be there. But I also teach at Marquette. And Marquette is a much more traditional university. It's got a philosophy department. It's less important than it used to be. As a matter of fact, all the humanities are less important than they used to be, say, 20 years ago when you had to take more classes. One of the things that Marquette did was created a class called Foundations of Philosophy, which is supposed to do all the heavy lifting that philosophy of human nature and ethics did in the past. I would say that that's not going to work. You need at least a couple more classes in philosophy. You can't get enough with just one semester. Interestingly, at Marquette, we did have a meeting, I remember years back before COVID, about that class. And there was a suggestion that there should be at least one shared reading across all of the sections of that. And you would be surprised how angry some of the graduate students and professors got at that suggestion, which is something that's very common at many other places. So I think I would impose that. I'd be like, we need to have at least some continuity here, some quality control, so that, we can be assured that at least some of the stuff that we want in a class is being taught.
Maybe that continuity can be Kant. Some continuity.
That might be a very unpopular, though. But what would you? So, let's say,
I've actually had a thought about this.
Okay.
And I think that one of the main things that I would do was to try to make kind of critical thinking and orthogonal thinking be part of a very wide breadth of different courses.
Okay.
That this is something that you're constantly have to re-engage with, and so this is not a course per se, but over the entire school. Okay, we need to make sure that if we're going to be talking about X, Y, or Z topic, that we need to know maybe a little of the history of the arguments against these things and why they eventually came to come to these conclusions about these things, and to make it so that people actually have to argue certain points, and not just automatically do kind of rote memorization and whatnot. This is less so for certain things in the humanities because there's a lot of that built in, but especially if you're going to go into the more technical things, engineering tends to produce people that are very I put it into the formula and it gets me this output. And in engineering, that's perfect. That's the exact thing you want to do as someone that is trying to be an engineer in the role of an engineer, but they're also a human, and they're going to be thrown into other places, and they're not going to fit into nice simple equations, and to make sure that this bit of critical thinking is suffused in all of that work.
They often will talk about that with the moniker of across the curriculum. So you can have critical thinking across the curriculum or writing across the curriculum. And I never got to implement this, but at one of the places that I was working for a while, I wanted to put together an ethics across the curriculum thing where it would be like, essentially what you'd be doing is teaching the teachers how to bring in some robust ethics stuff into all their classes and use the same terminology. Because one of the problems is like you go to like business ethics and they got all these weird terms that don't map on to what we do in actual philosophical ethics. And you're like, what the hell is this stuff? Right. And medical ethics as well. But, if you can do that, that's really powerful when you're reinforcing stuff across classes. So critical thinking would be a great one for doing that. And it would encompass things like, catching fallacies, making and breaking arguments, figuring out, whether an argument is deductive, inductive, or some other weird thing. Yeah. So that would be great. No, that's an interesting response, right? Because it's not about the philosophy curriculum as such. It's more like how philosophy gets its parasitic tendrils into everybody else's stuff, which is one of the things one of my colleagues actually used as a model. He's like, listen, we don't have a philosophy program here. We need to be a parasite. We need to have our whatever you want to call it. We need to be in everybody else's classes, and then they'll never get rid of us. They'll never fire us or anything like that because we'll be irreplaceable. Sort of like you can never tear the parasite out
without destroying the host.
Yeah.
It's like a thinking how to think or learning how to think.
Yeah.
And like there's lots of studies on like how people like acquire knowledge, and repetition is over time and at different intervals is one of the best things that like really harden an idea in one's mind.
Yeah. The other thing too, I will say this in a very pragmatic way. So like I was a co-founder of an ethics and business education project at Fayetteville State University. And it foundered after I left because nobody on the philosophy side would actually do the work to keep it going. The business people were super into it because they had a very practical motive. They needed this special accreditation, and you had to demonstrate that you were teaching the students ethics. And they didn't have a business ethics class. So I came in, and the goal was I'll help you like add more ethics content to your classes. And one of the things that I realized is the students, they don't want to hear philosophy people coming in and saying, here's what ethics is. And, you should be a good person. They're all like, yeah, those stupid philosophy people, totally impractical. But if their professors who they actually care about and respect are saying, this is important stuff, then it's a much easier sell, I imagine it would be so for engineering, imagine philosophers coming in and they're like, we're going to teach you engineers how to be ethical people. The engineers are going to be, screw you guys, let me finish my semester long class. And then I don't ever want to see you again, but if it's their professors who are saying, yeah, this is important stuff, now you can actually hook them.
Yeah, and it's not just one professor, even if they're like the one guy, but like all of them are like, marching the same tune in that regard.
Yeah, that's a problem too. When all of it gets farmed out to like one person, then that becomes the class that you just have to get through. And then now you can get back to your real work,
Right. I did my time in ethics, made it through. So I think we should get to the next one here, right?
Yeah. So how to get noticed by the philosophical community and work on journals and research papers without having an academic degree in philosophy. And they make an assertion here that isn't quite true. Phil Papers limits audience to non-academic philosophers. Phil Papers is just a place where you can upload your work, and there aren't really a lot of restrictions on it. But if I remember right, my answer was a little bit flippant, and I was like, "Well, you're not going to get noticed by the philosophical community because even the people that are in the philosophical community typically don't get noticed by the philosophical community. Just there's some big names, and of course, anything that they do is like a big draw. I suppose it's like being an actor, right?" Mm-hmm. 90% of the actors are essentially starving artists. They're not getting called back for auditions. Most of the work is going to a couple big names who keep getting stuff over and over again. It's that way in academics too, and I don't, frankly, I mean, I've published a lot of academic articles and book chapters and encyclopedia entries. You don't get anything for it, you're not going to get paid for it, and it's very hit and miss whether people read your stuff and care about it at all. I've written some papers where probably 5 people have read them. I've written others where totally unpredictably, hundreds of people have read them, and people come up to me at conferences and they're like, "Yeah, I read this thing that you wrote. It's really great." I'm like, "Well, that's nice that you said that," because I wouldn't have known,
Yeah.
So I this is kind of a non-starter for me, but except that I think that, and you tell me what you think about this because you're outside of traditional academia. I think there's a perception on the part of the public that it's more prestigious than it really is to publish something in an academic journal.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Like it gives you bona fides or.
Mm-hmm. Now, this is hard because all the things that you said, I guess I've seen some people that would be then kind of philosophical adjacent, especially through like YouTube. There's like the rise of the video essay became a big thing.
Yeah.
But that might get you like YouTube followers to a certain extent. Yeah. But then the question is not how do I get YouTube followers? It says how do I get noticed by the philosophical community? And that is another like a small little kind of insular group compared to the rest of the regular world. Yeah. And to break into that, you actually have to be doing something that they consider is valuable. And most of the time, video essays are not things that are seen as high value within the community, at least from my perception.
I think that's right. Yeah. It's changing a bit. I mean, there is they talk about like philosophy Twitter, right? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of people who share their work there, and some of them like to, argue with each other, debate. Mm-hmm. There's more popular writing happening, like in Medium and Substack and on other blogging platforms. And some of it can be like in between the like totally popular stuff and the very academically rigorous stuff. But yeah, there's still kind of like, tilting your nose up. That's not real philosophy kind of attitudes on a lot of people's part, including some young people, which is kind of surprising.
I'd say that if you're going to do that, you probably have to do some marketing for yourself and then also actually write papers that are well researched and sourced and have something interesting and new to say, as a way to try to bolster that. Like that's the only thing I can think of to be, thought of well within the philosophical community.
There's a lot of different ways to be thought of well. It could be for your publishing. It could also be because you do other kinds of good work, Writing encyclopedia articles sounds kind of mundane and boring, but I mean, encyclopedia articles probably inform a hell of a lot more people about philosophy than academic articles do,
I'm thinking of like, what is it? The Stanford.
There's 2 big ones, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And sometimes like something will be in Stanford and not in the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And sometimes the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy will be better. Or there's also this great 1,000-word repository of like short articles on, all sorts of topics, Or you could be you could be doing stuff for Wikipedia, right? I mean, improving the philosophy stuff there.
Yeah.
I mean, you won't get credit for it,
Yeah.
right? That's the one downside to that. But you won't have a byline at the bottom. But you're doing good work if you're getting rid of errors.
The Wikipedia cold mines, right? So I'm going to move on here.
Okay.
Is belief even necessary in life at all? Can I just know stuff and trust my logic experiences to arrive at truth?
I mean, I would say that probably 90% of the stuff that we think we know, we don't really know. We just have credence in it, whether you want to call it belief or trust or something like that. So yeah, belief is pretty important. Where would you get this idea that you would just like know stuff and trust in logic and experience? Is that something that you got from just knowing stuff and trust in logic or experience, or do you have a belief that that's going to lead you the right way, right?
So I guess I would start off this conversation with exactly how are you defining belief, because there's different ways you can define it. So if we say belief is something that you accept to be true, that would be one usage of the word belief. And there's another word like other words are like the things that you believe to be true in absence of any experience or knowledge or data.
Yeah.
And so for the first one, like you have to believe things because you can't know everything. I can't know that there's like not cyanide floating through the air in the next room over. I'm pretty certain that it's not there, and I believe it's not there, but that's fine.
Yeah.
That is enough for me to do it. There are certain things that you actually have to know, and so like obviously we talk about knowledge. We had a couple of whole conversations, but like there's correspondence theory or pragmatic
coherence,
theories, coherence. Correspondences that you have a justified true belief, that it has correspondence to something in reality. But like, what about ideas? Some ideas don't have a direct correlation to reality, and can you believe in those? And it gets muddy quick.
I just thought of something that's kind of a silly example, but I mean, how do I know that you're not just an AI on the other end? I'm just looking at you through this interface. You're supposed to be over there in Michigan right now, but I don't know, maybe you're in a server farm down in North Carolina, and you created a Dan bot to, you didn't feel like doing the show tonight, so you just like created this Dan bot to do all the work for you. How do you know I'm not doing that?
Right.
How does anybody watching this know that it's not just two AIs chatting back and forth to each other?
How do we know that the entire universe wasn't created last week and we just have the memories because they were programmed or created in such a way that we believe that we lived more than a week, but we didn't?
There you go. I mean, I don't think you can get away from, not to say we shouldn't strive to have evidence or rigorous reasoning or anything.
Absolutely.
Like that. But that's going to be like this little portion of our life. And then almost all the rest of it is varying degrees of belief, some of which is probably false, and then, some of which we probably, if we dug into it and had the time to rigorously go after it, which we don't, we would find it to be true, but we don't do that. So we just kind of take it for granted until something comes along and says, this doesn't make sense,
Right. That's one of the reasons that we should stay intellectually curious, because if you are no longer intellectually curious, then you shut off that possibility that things could not be the way that we have always thought them to be.
Makes you more resilient too, because if things do change radically, like let's say you have the belief that I'm just going to get a job at the factory and it's always going to be open and that my pension will be there. Well, you're probably screwed now. Yeah. And now you need to figure out what the hell you're going to do. And if you've got like all these old beliefs that you just didn't update, you're going to have a rougher time than somebody who's been, how did you put it, intellectually curious, adapting themselves. Yeah.
Right. And so, for example, I went to school for computer science, and that was way before the current era of AI. that is something that one has to now contend with and know, and so that's something I have to actually learn, and I've been digging into at a deeper and deeper level. Because if I don't, then I'm going to be significantly at a less advantageous position to be able to get another job, whatever my next job is.
I mean, even just thinking about the languages that people learned in the course of a computer science degree. You know, there was a time when COBOL and Fortran and Pascal were like, those were the cutting edge languages. You know, I had a friend who actually, she could kind of write her own ticket, as they say, because she got into Oracle database management, like on the ground floor, you know? And so she had the maximum amount of experience that a person could have on that. So, you know, she could like get really good jobs with that. But is that something that, you know, like 10 years from now, anyone's going to care about? I doubt it, you know? I mean, she'll probably be retired by then, but.
Well, then you go. But like, I guess to directly respond to that, there are certain like financial institutions that are still running on like 60-year-old COBOL code.
Yeah.
I don't know, it's 60, but like it's ancient, especially in the world of computer science. And if you know those things, then you can also punch your ticket. But to go back to this question really quick, at the end, maintain that your curiosity, and there's a I don't know, an idiom, not an idiom, but like an idea of try to believe as many true things as possible and to not believe as many false things as possible.
Here's a follow-up. What if the things that you, for the moment, are believing to be true are inconsistent with each other, but not like in your face contradiction inconsistent, right? Where you're being so believe A and believe exactly not A. It's more like not everything adds up. Are you okay with living like that for a while? Or would that like really rankle
I remember having a conversation with a gentleman who's now passed, but he was very adamantly against Thanksgiving. He was originally from England.
Okay.
And because it was like part of like it's a celebration of the subjugation of the native peoples of America. And I can understand that. And I can also understand that Thanksgiving is also basically a harvest festival, and it is more often has more ideas than just that one idea.
Right.
And so he wanted me to throw everything out because it had at least that part of it to it. And I'm like, I can understand that and not like that about that, but I can also really like Thanksgiving and the community and the Harvest Festival and at least the way that we've massaged this a little bit into trying to be, at least reverential of the native peoples.
Kids like enjoying the turkey and all that. And, in elementary school.
And so like there's a little bit of overlap. Like, I guess how hardline do you have to be? I'm not quite sure.
Okay. I think that actually might be an interesting topic for us to pursue later on down the line. So I think we got time for one more.
Yeah. You have a favorite? The next one.
Let's do the next one. Yeah.
Okay.
So a scholar I know claimed philosophy is the study of arguments. I thought this was silly as it would exclude aphorism, for example, Nietzsche and philosophical fiction. What do you think? I mean, arguments are pretty damn important in philosophy, including for Nietzsche. Nietzsche didn't just write aphorisms. He does have narratives and stuff like that. Philosophical fiction has arguments in it. Dostoevsky's characters argue back and forth, but I think what they're getting at here is sometimes you get people who are like, the only thing we care about is arguments.
When I first read this, I rankled at it a little bit, but then I was like, okay, what is an argument? An argument is like someone trying to assert something about the world with some sort of like supporting evidence. Yeah. And it's not just like I'm going to yell at you or something. This is actually like a well done philosophical argument usually has an interlocutor as you're trying to formulate the best argument. So that's someone that you're having a conversation with, and the idea is we're working together against a problem or a thought or something, and trying to come to the best idea or conclusion about these thoughts. And like fiction, Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, all the others that they're still like at the end they're trying to impart an idea, and through the narrative provide some supporting evidence to this idea to try to get it through, because sometimes they're kind of abstract in the way that we usually interact with the world, and you need to have that narrative to try to like package it in a way that it gets through your skull.
Yeah. Or it gets some traction, you could say, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think there's a wide variety of things that can count as arguments. So it doesn't always have to be like the formal syllogism, you know, two premises and a conclusion, and then maybe arrange that as, you know, a sorites. I mean, you can do that. That's certainly possible. It's kind of funny because Thomas Aquinas, in his commentary on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle is known as being like the father of the syllogism. He kind of is, kind of isn't, because he uses the word syllogism also to talk about like practical reasoning and anger and what it does and all that. So he's a little bit more loosey-goosey. Thomas Aquinas tries to shoehorn all of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics into that syllogistic formula. And he's like, here's the major premise, here's the minor premise. And you're like, that isn't what Aristotle's doing at all, you know? It's cool that you think that that's a cool thing to do, but that's not a good way to understand the text, you know. But Aristotle's doing argument in a different way, you know. It's not like he's just like, you know, asserting stuff, you know. Ethics is good, be virtuous. You know?
Yeah. And sometimes when we formalize things too much, it cuts out some of the content and the quality of it.
Yeah.
And that becomes difficult. And then maybe you need to, if you want to try to actually formalize it, you need to have different ways of formalization, because especially when we're talking about like classic syllogisms, there can be a lot left to be wanted from that format.
Or even more powerful modern logics. You still can't get everything that you want into it, you know?
And part of that is just our language is really messy, and it becomes very difficult to have a single meaning that is going to be universally understood. And
yeah, not with any term that really matters. You know, you can do that with things that you like artificially define, you know, way over here, but then getting people to be interested in that's a whole different challenge, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I'm interested in what our quote of the day will be. So,
me too.
We leave you today with the words of Tony Robbins. Successful people ask better questions, and as a result, they get better answers.